Cedar Creek Medical's fluorescent corridors smell like antiseptic and floor wax at 5 a.m. when Rachel Torres arrives for her shift, her scrubs pressed sharp as dress blues, a faint limp favoring her left side that she's learned to hide by the third step. She pushes through the staff entrance with her badge clipped sideways, employee number 3847, temporary staff, credentialing pending, and the morning silence presses against her like a weight she's used to carrying. The lockers in the basement staff room are the color of institutional gray, numbered in faded paint, and hers sits between a nurse named Jennifer who leaves motivational post-its and an empty space where someone else used to belong. Rachel opens locker 3847 and stares at the pair of worn combat boots sitting on the top shelf. Black leather, cracked from desert heat and hard use, laces still tied in special forces knots that she tied herself 12 years ago in a place that officially never happened. The boots are the only thing she kept. She closes the door quietly, listening to the soft metallic click of the lock engaging. At 5:06 a.m., Rachel moves through the ICU in practice silence. Her hands are steady as she counts medication vials, verifying each one twice against the digital chart, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone who learned long ago that mistakes kill people. 3 nurses are already positioned at the station, permanent staff, credentialed for 7 to 15 years, and they watch her with the particular coldness reserved for temporary workers who might steal their overtime. She doesn't acknowledge them. In the break room, she drinks black coffee that tastes like it was brewed yesterday and reviews patient charts on a tablet, her eye scanning lab values and vitals with the focused intensity of a field medic reading combat casualties. The numbers tell stories. Septic shock. Post-op infection. Respiratory compromise. She knows what they mean before the doctors do, but that's not her job. Her job is to exist quietly and collect a paycheck until the background investigation either clears or flags her, and she's learned not to bet on clearance. 2 permanent nurses enter the break room, Sandra with 17 years of seniority and her shadow, Michelle, who laughs at everything Sandra says. They stop talking the moment Rachel looks up. "Sorry," Sandra says, not meaning it. "We didn't see you there." Rachel nods once and returns to the tablet. She has learned that silence is easier than conversation. Silence doesn't require explanations. Silence doesn't invite questions about the gaps in her employment history or why her references are all military installations that no longer list her on their rosters or why her credentials application got flagged by some automated system that caught something everyone else missed. At 6:15 a.m., Dr. Marcus Caldwell arrives at Cedar Creek Medical the way actors arrive at premieres, with intention, with the certain knowledge that people will adjust themselves around his presence. He's 53, silver-haired in a way that suggests expensive grooming, his surgical coat spotless and pressed, his hands uncalloused and manicured with the precision of someone who hasn't actually performed surgery in 4 years. A trail of residents follow him like remoras trailing a shark, their white coats still stiff from the hospital laundry, their faces arranged in the particular expression of exhaustion and deference that defines the surgical hierarchy. He laughs at something one of them says, he finishes the punchline before they do, and the residents laugh harder, the sound bouncing off the ICU walls like they've been given permission to inhabit space. Rachel watches from the medication station where she's restocking the crash cart, her movements mechanical and efficient. She places each vial in its designated slot with the same care a surgeon uses placing sutures. Epinephrine. Amiodarone. Atropine. Her hands know where everything goes before her mind does. Muscle memory is just another word for training that lives in your fingers. Caldwell notices her eventually because he notices everything in his domain, the way a king notices a piece on a chessboard that doesn't belong to him yet. He stops in the doorway, his entourage stopping with him, and watches Rachel work with an expression that shifts from curiosity to something sharper. "You're the temp," he says. Not a question. She nods once, not looking up from the cart. "How long?" "Through Friday," she says quietly. Her voice is soft, deferential, the voice of someone who has learned to take up as little space as possible. She uses the hospital code name she was given, Rachel Torres, RN, never the rank that used to precede it, never the unit patch that used to sit above her heart on dress uniforms that got burned in a Pentagon incinerator along with her entire service record. Caldwell watches her for 3 seconds longer than necessary, and his jaw tightens slightly. "What's your credential status?" "Still processing," she says. She slides the crash cart closed and locks it with a soft click that sounds louder than it should. "Background check." "Background check," he repeats, as if the words taste like something metal. "And before Cedar Creek, where were you working?" Rachel picks up an empty medication tray. "Various facilities." That's not an answer. She turns to face him, and something in her posture shifts, nothing dramatic, nothing that would read as resistance, just the smallest adjustment of her weight toward her right foot, the subtle positioning of someone who understands the geometry of rooms and exit routes. "Contract positions," she says. "Short-term assignments. Nothing permanent." Caldwell smiles. It's the smile of a man who has just identified weakness. Maybe if you spent less time trying to be a hero and more time learning how hospitals actually work, you'd still have a career by Friday. The silence after his words is the kind of silence that happens in operating rooms when something goes wrong and everyone freezes before they move. Rachel's jaw tightens for 1 beat, 2 beats. Her eyes stay level with his. She doesn't defend herself. She doesn't explain. She doesn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her flinch, and that restraint, that absolute refusal to break, seems to frustrate him more than anger would have. He turns and walks away, his residents scurrying to keep pace, and the hum of the ICU machinery resumes like nothing happened. But something did happen. Something small and quiet and measured, and the other nurses saw it. They saw her not react, and that's what people remember about people who've learned to survive things that normal people don't survive. Not the strength. Not the control. But the absence of fear. Around 7 a.m., the morning shift change begins in earnest. Nurses arrive in clusters, hanging jackets in the staff room, checking assignment sheets, beginning the ritual handoff that keeps the machine running. Rachel moves through these moments with the invisibility of someone who has learned to be present without being noticed. She passes a window that overlooks the parking lot and catches her reflection in the glass, 38 years old, dark hair pulled tight in a bun that's regulation tight without being regulation uniform, a thin white scar running from her left ear to collarbone that she never explains to people who ask. The scar is from shrapnel. The way her left shoulder sits slightly lower than her right is from the field surgery she performed on herself in the back of a Humvee while rounds were still landing outside the vehicle. The limp that she hides by the 3rd step every morning is from a fracture that healed wrong because there wasn't time to set it properly. These are the things that her combat boots could tell someone if boots could talk. These are the things hidden in the gaps of her employment history, in the rejected credential applications, in the fact that no one at Cedar Creek Medical knows that the temp nurse with the sparse resume and the sparse conversation is someone who carried an 8-year-old boy 2 miles through active combat while taking fire that was meant for a Marine lieutenant who was bleeding out and screaming. But that's not her job here. Her job is to stock medication carts and follow Dr. Caldwell's orders and keep her head down until Friday. Except something in the way Caldwell looked at her, something hungry and territorial, suggests that Friday might come much faster than she planned. The hospital's machinery continues around her, vital signs beeping, ventilators wheezing their mechanical rhythms, the organized controlled chaos of healing, and Rachel Torres moves through it all like a ghost moving through a hospital she used to know, in a life that used to be hers, wearing the face of someone who had learned to disappear long before she ever arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. Grand rounds at Cedar Creek Medical begin at 8 o'clock sharp, the way they have for 30 years, the way Dr. Caldwell ensures they always will. 20 residents and attending physicians crowd around bed 12 where an elderly patient recuperates from bowel resection, his abdomen wrapped in clean gauze, monitors beside him registering the quiet work of healing. The fluorescent lights overhead cast everything in clinical white. Caldwell holds court in the center of the cluster, his voice carrying the weight of institutional certainty, explaining post-operative protocols with the precision of a man who has never been questioned successfully. He gestures to the chart, points to medication timelines, and then he stops mid-sentence. His eyes find Rachel standing against the far wall, hands at her sides, face neutral as concrete. "You. Temp nurse. Come here." She steps forward. The room's attention follows her like a weapon tracking movement. Caldwell's smile is the smile of a predator recognizing prey that doesn't yet understand the danger. "This is what incompetence looks like," he announces to the room, loud enough for the residents in the back to hear, loud enough for the attending physicians to register the words. "This nurse right here, what's your name again?" "Torres." Torres documented vitals every 4 hours instead of every 2 on a post-surgical patient yesterday. She questioned my antibiotic orders without authorization. She repositioned and 4 without consulting the resident. Each accusation spins from fragments of truth into something different, something deliberate. Rachel's jaw tightens almost imperceptibly. A muscle works along her temple, there and gone. She keeps her eyes fixed on a point behind his head, somewhere on the wall, somewhere that isn't his face. In my 23 years, I've learned that dangerous nurses are the ones who think they know better than doctors. The ones who freelance. The ones who create liability. A resident snickers, a younger man, fresh out of medical school, still learning how power works in these hallways. Caldwell's smile broadens. He's won the room. "Any response, Torres?" She swallows once. The sound is audible in the silence. "No, doctor." "Good. That's what I thought." Caldwell turns back to the patient, back to his residents, back to the machinery of his authority, dismissing her with the casualty of a man accustomed to being obeyed. Rachel walks out of grand rounds without looking at anyone. Her hands are steady. Her breathing is controlled. The trembling isn't fear, it's restraint, the kind of restraint that comes from having survived worse than words in a hospital hallway. At 11 o'clock, Rachel is restocking supply closets on the 4th floor, moving methodically through gauze packs and trauma shears and 4 supplies, arranging each item in its designated slot with the precision of muscle memory. The work is meditative. The work requires nothing but hands and attention. 2 surgical nurses find her there, the blonde one from the cafeteria, the brunette who always laughs too loud at Caldwell's jokes. They stand in the doorway like they've been waiting. "Hey, temp," the blonde one says, and there's something in her voice that Rachel recognizes immediately. This isn't kindness. This is an errand. Caldwell was at the vending machines this morning telling everyone you probably got fired from your last 3 hospitals. He called you Captain Clipboard. Said you chart like you're filing a police report. They watch her face for cracks. Rachel places another gauze pack into its designated slot, hands perfectly steady, and continues. "He said you walk like you've got a stick up your ass," the brunette adds, laughing, watching for the reaction that won't come. Rachel counts the packs under her breath, 64, 65, 66, and doesn't look up. Her hands don't pause. Her breathing doesn't change. The nurses stand there for another 5 seconds, waiting for something, a flinch, a defensive word, anything that would confirm they've landed a blow. Nothing comes. They leave disappointed, their laughter fading down the corridor like water draining from a sink. Rachel finishes restocking. She moves to the next closet. The work continues. The work always continues. At 6 o'clock, the evening shift settles into the ICU's controlled rhythm, monitors beeping their steady pulse, ventilators wheeze their mechanical breath, nurses moving between bays with the choreography of routine. Rachel approaches the main desk where Dr. Caldwell is writing notes on a patient chart, his fountain pen moving across the paper with deliberate strokes. Marcus Webb lies in Bay 7, post-operative day 2 from gallbladder removal, and his monitors are beginning to tell a story that nobody wants to read. His white blood cell count has climbed to 14,800. His blood pressure is drifting downward, 89/52 and dropping. His oxygen saturation sits at 89%, the threshold where complications begin to whisper. Dr. Caldwell, patient in Bay 7 needs broader-spectrum antibiotics, Rachel says quietly, standing beside the desk but not too close, maintaining the distance that acknowledges his position. His white count is elevated, BP is declining, and his SATs are. Caldwell doesn't look up from his writing. "Are you a physician, Torres?" "No, but..." "Then don't practice medicine." The words are flat, dismissive, the tone of a man who has ended this conversation before it began. His blood pressure is dropping, Rachel says anyway, and something in her voice shifts, not aggression, not defiance, just information delivered with the weight of someone who has seen what happens when infections take root. The sepsis markers are. Caldwell slams his pen down on the desk with enough force to make the chart jump. His head comes up, his eyes find hers, and in that moment his institutional power coalesces into something visible and unmistakable. Security to ICU desk, he calls across the unit, loud enough for every nurse and resident and attending physician to hear. Loud enough to make the point. Escort this nurse out of the unit. She's done for the day. A guard appears within 90 seconds. Cedar Creek Medical's response time is reliably efficient. Rachel looks at Marcus Webb's monitor one last time. Oxygen saturation at 89% and trending downward. She doesn't argue. She doesn't explain. She walks past the guard station without looking back, her face an unreadable mask, the kind of composure that comes from understanding that some battles aren't won in moments, they're won in the years after, when the truth finally arrives. The evening falls around Portland like a heavy cloth. Rachel is sitting in her studio apartment at 2:14 a.m., still wearing her scrubs, staring at the pair of worn combat boots on the shelf in her closet, the only remnant of a life officially erased, the only proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres ever existed anywhere except in classified files that no longer acknowledge her. Her phone buzzes. The caller ID shows Cedar Creek Medical. She stares at the screen for 3 rings before answering. Torres? It's Jenny from ICU. Marcus Webb just crashed. Full arrest. His belly, there was infection, sepsis. Caldwell's orders weren't. Jenny's voice cracks, and Rachel can hear the monitors screaming in the background, the sound of a patient dying while protocols fail him. Caldwell's 20 minutes out and the resident is freezing and we need help. Please. Rachel doesn't answer. She hangs up and stares at her hands in the darkness, hands that held a bleeding child in Ramadi, hands that carried life through rubble under fire, hands that have learned the cost of refusing to move. Her phone buzzes again. Please, Jenny texts. Just one word. She's in her car before she decides to be. The staff entrance at Cedar Creek Medical is unlocked at 2:31 a.m. The night guard knows her by now, waves her through without question, doesn't ask why a suspended nurse is returning to a hospital in the middle of the night. Rachel moves through the corridors with the muscle memory of someone who used to run tactical operations in the dark. She knows every turn, every corner, every back route to the ICU. Bay 7 is chaos. The monitors are screaming their electronic panic, the resident is performing chest compressions with terrible form, too shallow, too slow, every motion betraying panic rather than training. 2 nurses struggle with intubation equipment. Marcus Webb's chest is already cracked open from emergency thoracotomy, and his heart lies exposed and still, unbeating, dying meat in the surgical field. Rachel moves without hesitation. Move, she says quietly. The resident stammers, doesn't move, continues his ineffective compressions. Rachel says it again, louder, and this time it isn't a request. Move. She scrubs fast, 30 seconds of surgical soap, gloves snapping on like a weapon being chambered, and her hands plunge into the open chest cavity. The warmth of blood, the texture of tissue, the precise anatomical landscape her body remembers from training she's never officially received. Her fingers find the heart muscle, slippery and still, and she begins direct cardiac massage, squeeze, release, feeling for the rhythm that should be there, feeling for life. The resident stares at her hands. How do you know how to? Time the compressions, Rachel snaps, and her voice has dropped an octave, carrying the weight of command authority. Call out every 15 seconds. Prepare another amp of epi. 3 minutes pass. 4. Her shoulders burn with the familiar ache of muscles pushed to their limit, an ache she remembers from other operations, other emergencies, other moments when the boundary between life and death became something tangible under her hands. The heart is fragile, dying, slipping through her fingers like water. At 6 minutes, she feels it, a flutter, barely perceptible, then a twitch, then something that might be a beat. She keeps compression steady. At 6 minutes 30 seconds, the flutter becomes a rhythm. The monitor spikes. Alarms change their tone. Marcus Webb's heart begins pumping on its own. Rachel steps back, hands dripping blood to her elbows, breathing hard, and in the silence that follows, the only sound is the ventilator's mechanical breath and the steady rhythm of a heart that shouldn't be beating but is. That's when Dr. Caldwell walks through the bay doors. He stops. Takes in the scene with the careful attention of a man whose authority is being rewritten in front of him. Rachel covered in blood. The patient stabilizing. The resident staring at something he doesn't understand. Something dangerous in the way Rachel is breathing, something that makes the air in the room feel like it's under pressure. "Get her out of here," Caldwell says to security, his voice steady but the steadiness of a man who just realized he's made a calculation error. Now. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2:14 a.m., Rachel sat on the edge of her studio apartment bed in full scrubs, her eyes fixed on the closet shelf where the combat boots waited. Worn leather, scuffed at the heels, the left boot creased exactly where her ankle bent, the only physical proof that Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres had ever existed. She hadn't reached for them. Not yet. Her phone had rung 40 minutes ago, the hospital's night supervisor's voice tight and urgent, septic patient, post-op, crashing, resident needed immediately. Rachel had said nothing. Hung up. Stared at those boots and wondered if staying invisible was worth the cost of never being able to save anyone again. Her hands moved before her brain caught up. Scrubs still on. Keys. Phone. Car running before she'd finished locking the apartment door. Cedar Creek Medical rose from the rain-soaked Portland streets like a monument to everything she'd tried to leave behind, fluorescent lights bleeding into wet concrete, the muted wail of an ambulance somewhere in the distance. Rachel parked in the employee lot, hood pulled forward, shoulders curved inward, playing the role she'd perfected over 8 years and 6 hospitals. Just the temp nurse. No one important. No one worth remembering. The ER entrance doors slid open with a whisper of rubber against tile, and the smell hit her immediately, antiseptic layered over something darker, blood and copper and the particular stench of sepsis. Decay masked in clinical language. The ICU corridor was controlled chaos. A resident she'd never seen before stood frozen outside Bay 7, face the color of hospital ceiling tiles. Night charge nurse Marcus called to her, "Rachel, thank God. He's gone south fast. Caldwell's en route but ETA is 20 minutes. Patient's post-op day 2, infection screening was negative yesterday, but fever spiked to 103.8 about an hour ago, and then Rachel was already moving past him. The bay doors swung inward and she took in the scene in the 2 seconds it took to assess, male patient, early 60s, chest cracked open with surgical retractors holding the incision, heart monitor showing a flat line that came to life in occasional, desperate electrical bursts, electrical noise without mechanical purpose. Asystole masquerading as rhythm. His skin had taken on the waxy gray of someone whose oxygen delivery had flatlined 20 minutes ago. He coded 5 minutes in, the resident said behind her, his voice shaking. We got him cracked open immediately but his hands were trembling. Adrenaline without training. Fear without a framework. Rachel didn't answer. She moved to the left side of the surgical field, her hands already steady on the exposed pericardium. The muscle beneath her fingers was flaccid, useless, a pump that had simply stopped. Around her, nurses moved with practiced efficiency, someone had the amiodarone ready, the crash cart was positioned, EKG lead still monitored the rhythm that wasn't there. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like angry insects, casting harsh white geometry across the sterile field. Blood on the instruments. Blood on the drapes. Blood pooling slowly in the cavity where a heart should have been working. Get me direct access, Rachel said. Not a request. The words came out in a voice that didn't belong to the temp nurse, deeper, weighted with something the resident had never heard before. His hand steadied immediately, not from courage but from the recognition of command structure. Someone who knew. Someone who had done this before. She positioned her hand into the chest cavity, palm upward, fingers finding the failing heart. The muscle was warm, slick with blood and viscera. Her first compression felt like pushing through rubber, the ventricle resisting, then yielding. Compress. Release. Compress. Release. Her other hand braced against the chest wall, providing the counterpressure that would drive blood to the brain, to the lungs, to anywhere except where it was pooling uselessly below her wrists. Pain was information. Her hands knew what to do with that information. 80 compressions per minute. The metronome of resuscitation. Around her, someone was pushing epinephrine, 1 mg 4, while the anesthesiologist worked the bag valve mask, pushing oxygen into lungs that still refused to expand. The resident watched Rachel's face and saw nothing. No fear. No doubt. Just the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst this profession could offer. How long's she been doing this? Someone whispered. For minutes, Marcus said. For minutes of direct cardiac massage. For minutes of her bare hand pumping a dead man's heart. For minutes of muscle memory and training that should have stayed buried in Ramadi, in redacted medical records, in the classified operations that the Pentagon had spent 8 years making disappear. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Electrical activity. Faint. Almost apologetic. Rachel felt it before the monitor registered it, the subtle change in resistance under her palm, the heart beginning to push back against her compressions instead of accepting them passively. A flutter became a beat, became a rhythm. Sinus. Organized. Real. We have a pulse, the anesthesiologist said, and there was something like disbelief in his voice. BP climbing. 70/40. 85/50. Holding at 95/60. Rachel withdrew her hand slowly, her fingers trailing blood across the surgical field. She stepped back from the table. Her scrubs were soaked dark red from waist to shoulder, her hands painted with someone else's biology, and her face remained absolutely blank. Not even breathing hard. That's when Dr. Caldwell entered the bay. He stopped in the doorway. His eyes traveled from the open chest to Rachel's blood-covered scrubs to the monitor displaying a living rhythm, and something shifted in his expression. Not confusion. Understanding. The kind of understanding that recognized capability so far beyond his own that it couldn't be quantified in institutional hierarchies or board connections. She had just performed a procedure that required not just medical knowledge but the kind of unshakable nerve that came from having done it under fire. Literally under fire. Caldwell's jaw tightened. He looked at the resident. Get Dr. Palmer down here. We need cardiothoracic to evaluate for repair. His voice was steady, professional, but his eyes kept finding Rachel. Still covered in blood. Still saying nothing. Still meeting his gaze with the kind of calm that looked like certainty. The patient coded 5 minutes before we arrived, Marcus offered. This nurse performed direct. I can see what she performed, Caldwell said quietly. His hands were clenched at his sides. 2 hours ago, he'd had her escorted from the building. 2 hours ago, he'd initiated calls to 3 board members, setting in motion the machinery that would erase her employment history and leave her reputation in tatters. And now she'd just saved a patient he'd already consigned to the mortality statistics in his mind. Rachel moved toward the sink without being dismissed. She turned on the water and began washing the blood from her hands with methodical precision. The water ran pink, then clear. The nurse beside her, the one who'd watched her compress a dead man's heart back to life, stepped back reflexively, as if proximity to that kind of capability was dangerous. Caldwell pulled out his phone. Made a call before Rachel had even finished drying her hands. Tom, it's David. We need to move faster on the suspension. I want her removed from the building by 6 p.m. today. Security escort, full security protocol. A pause. No, I don't care if it creates optics. She's a liability and I want her gone before the investigator completes his review. Another pause. The hiss of air from the ventilator beside her patient. Because she just saved a septic patient that I already know is going to circulate back into the patient population, and I need that off the books before anyone starts asking how someone with her background was allowed clinical privileges in the first place. Rachel turned off the tap. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the corridor, an alarm chimed. A normal night in a hospital full of people fighting smaller battles, saving smaller patients, making smaller mistakes. But in Bay 7, something fundamental had shifted. The temperature had changed. The power structure had cracked. By 9 a.m., the investigator had finished his preliminary report. By noon, Caldwell had reviewed 17 flag charts. By 3 p.m., the suspension letter was printed and waiting. By 6 p.m., security escorted Rachel to her locker while rain hammered against the hospital windows like applause no one had asked for. She took only the boots. At 4:33 a.m., Dr. Caldwell sat in his office with the lights off except for the glow of his desk lamp, phone pressed to his ear. Thomas Harrington, board chair, answered on the second ring like he'd been waiting. "We have a liability problem," Caldwell said, voice steady as a scalpel. "Rachel Torres. The temp nurse. She's been signing out medications without proper documentation. Her credentialing file is sparse, there are gaps. Employment history doesn't add up." Harrington's silence lasted 3 seconds. "How sparse?" "Ramadi deployment to nothing. 12 years of her life just missing. No hospital affiliation, no residency information, no references that check out. She's either a fraud or she's hiding something." Caldwell let that settle. "Either way, she's a liability. The patient she resuscitated, if something goes wrong with his recovery, we need her credential file to be the problem, not our post-op protocol. I'll call the investigator." Harrington hung up. By 5:15 a.m., Caldwell had called 3 board members. Not confrontation, strategy. He pulled Rachel's sparse employment file and read it aloud to each one. No permanent address before 18 months ago. No Medicare provider number before 2 years ago. No malpractice history because she's never been permanently credentialed anywhere. The words landed like accusations. By 6:44 a.m., before the sun rose over Portland, an external investigator named Robert Morrison was already reading the authorization to review every chart Rachel Torres had touched in the past 6 weeks, every medication she'd signed out, every procedure note with her name on it. Caldwell's attorney friend, a man named Pierce who billed $450 an hour and owed favors to hospital administrators across 3 counties, had drafted the termination letter with surgical precision. The language was careful. Credentialing irregularities under investigation sounded clinical, official, impossible to fight. Not "we know who you are." Just "we're looking, and what we find will destroy you." Security cleared her locker at 6 p.m. Rachel didn't resist. She opened the metal door, pulled out her backup stethoscope, the spare scrub she kept for double shifts, the protein bars she never ate. Then she reached for the pair of worn combat boots, tan leather scuffed from desert sand that wouldn't wash out, soles worn thin from running through Ramadi rubble. She held them for a second, just held them, then tucked them under her arm. The security guard watching her said nothing. He'd been instructed not to. HR handed her the suspension letter at 6:15 p.m. in a small glass office that smelled like new carpet and fear. Rachel read it once. "Pending investigation into credentialing irregularities, you are suspended effective immediately. Your hospital privileges are revoked pending outcome of external review." The word swam. Not fired yet. Worse, suspended. In limbo. Credibility destroyed before anyone could even ask why. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She folded the letter in half and walked out with the boot still under her arm. At 3 a.m., Rachel sat in an empty diner on Powell Boulevard, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and a waitress who'd seen too many people break in the middle of the night to ask questions. Her coffee had gone cold 2 hours ago. The cup sat in front of her, a dark ring of oil on the surface, untouched. The waitress, name tag read Diane, had refilled it twice without asking. She'd stopped trying to make conversation after the first cup. The couple in the corner booth left at 2:40 a.m., fumbling with their check like they had somewhere to be at 3 a.m. on a Thursday. The drunk at the counter had paid and stumbled out into the rain at 2:55 a.m., muttering about a job he lost. Now it was just Rachel and Diane and the fluorescent lights overhead, humming like insects trapped in plastic. Rachel stared at her reflection in the black window. The glass turned reflective when the outside turned dark, turned into a mirror she couldn't escape. She saw her own face looking back at her, dark circles under her eyes like shadows cut into bone, the white scar on her neck pale against her skin, hands wrapped around the mug for warmth she didn't feel. The rain hammered the window like it was trying to get in, like it was trying to tell her something. She thought about Ramadi, the dust so thick it coated your lungs, the heat that made you feel like your blood was boiling, the weight of an 8-year-old boy bleeding into her arms as she ran through rubble while gunfire tore chunks from concrete 3 inches from her head. She thought about the Pentagon debrief 3 weeks after they extracted, the room with no windows, the admiral whose name she never learned, the words that rewrote her entire existence. The operation didn't happen, Master Chief. You understand? Ramadi 2004 was a classified deep ops recovery. 17 lives extracted, 0 documentation. Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres was killed in a training accident on base. You understand what that means? She understood. She disappeared. Became a ghost with a nursing license and no past, because the only way to keep the people she saved alive was to be dead herself. Became the temp nurse nobody noticed, the invisible woman in scrubs, the one people looked through instead of at. 12 years of invisible service. 12 years of wondering if it mattered. She wondered now if Marcus Webb had a family sitting in a waiting room, if they were drinking the same burnt coffee from the same chipped cups, if saving his life, again, always saving him, was worth surfacing even slightly from the invisible life she'd built. She wondered if staying hidden was worth losing the only identity she had left, the one that meant something, not the soldier, not the operative, not the legend that the Pentagon had buried in an unmarked grave. The nurse. The one who helps. The one who saves. The one who matters. Her phone was face down on the table. She hadn't looked at it in 2 hours. She wouldn't. Whatever came next would come whether she was ready or not. The waitress brought the check without being asked, for $1.75 for 3 cups of coffee Rachel hadn't drunk. Rachel left a 20 and walked out into the rain without waiting for change. At 6:42 a.m., Rachel was walking to her car in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot. She didn't know why she'd come back, couldn't explain it even to herself, some pull she couldn't name, when the screaming started. It came from inside the building, from the ICU entrance, a roar that cut through the rain-soaked morning like a warning siren. A man came through the automatic doors, and Rachel stopped walking. He had to be 7 feet tall, maybe more, built like a freight truck that had been taught to walk upright. His face was wild, eyes tracking, searching. He held a tire iron in his right hand, the metal streaked black with rust or something worse. When he opened his mouth, the words came in Arabic accented English. Where is SHE? The nurse who killed my brother in Ramadi. The American woman who murdered Khalid. Staff scattered like birds. A nurse dropped her tablet and ran toward the stairwell. Security reached for radios. An administrator backed toward the administrative wing. Rachel froze, 20 feet away, because she recognized his face. Not from yesterday or last week. From 18 years ago. From a rooftop in Ramadi where his brother Khalid had pinned her position and his brother Khalid had fired a PKM machine gun and his brother Khalid had dropped her with shrapnel through her left shoulder while she was carrying an 8-year-old boy. She'd put 2 rounds center mass before she bled out. He'd disappeared into the city. She'd thought he was dead, she'd hoped he was dead. The big man's eye swept the lobby once, twice, and found her. Recognition detonated behind his pupils. You. He charged. No hesitation. Pure forward momentum, tire iron raised like a weapon, like an execution waiting to happen. Rachel didn't run. She'd never run from something that was already running at her. She moved right, let his charge pass, and in the moment his body committed to forward motion, she grabbed his extended arm just below the elbow, locked the joint, and used his own momentum, a physics problem, force equals mass times acceleration, to drive him face-first into the tile floor. 3 seconds flat. The impact cracked the floor. She heard his breath explode out of his lungs. Her knee slammed into his spine, her right hand cranked his wrist until the bone articulation reached the point of break, and her voice came out cold and steady and command-trained, restraints. Now. Security Supervisor James Reeves arrived running, stopped dead, and stared at Rachel's hand position, at the way she controlled a man twice her size without visible strain, at the mechanical precision of someone who'd done this exact movement 10,000 times. His face went pale. "Master Chief," he said quietly. Just 2 words. Everything stopped. The lobby air went still. Rachel looked up, met his eyes, and said nothing. She didn't need to. Security appeared with restraints. Rachel kept the attacker controlled, his wrist still cranked, her knee still anchored, her breathing still steady, while they fitted him with soft restraints. He screamed in Arabic. She didn't react. Marcus Webb appeared from the ICU then, moving slowly, pale, still in his hospital gown from gallbladder surgery 6 hours ago. He was supposed to be in bed. He walked straight toward the crowd anyway, eyes finding Rachel. "That's her," he said, voice carrying across the lobby like testimony. "That's Reaper." Whispers detonated through the gathered staff. Questions, denial, impossibility spreading like shrapnel. Someone said Reaper like they were translating a language they didn't understand. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 26 years old, 2nd Battalion, just promoted, stepped into the center of the lobby with his full line still attached, dripping medication into his arm. "Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres," he said, each word landing like a hammer. "Special Forces, Naval Special Warfare Command. Ramadi, 2004. The lobby went so quiet you could hear the rain outside, hear the monitors beeping in the ICU, hear the air conditioning system humming through the vents overhead. Dr. Caldwell arrived from the parking garage, stopped at the edge of the crowd, and his face drained of color like someone had pulled a plug. 2 nurses gasped. A resident pulled out his phone to record. The restrained attacker stopped struggling, stared at Rachel, and something like despair crossed his face. Marcus Webb continued, voice breaking, "Master Chief carried me 2 miles through enemy fire when I was 8 years old. Took shrapnel meant for me. Lost 3 team members getting me to extraction." Another pause. James Reeves stepped forward, uniform already straight, posture already changing. "Navy Cross," he said, recognition dawning like sunrise. "The Ramadi rescue. I heard about it at Quantico. They said the operator didn't make it. The mission didn't exist," Marcus said. "The ceremony never happened. The Pentagon buried the whole operation. But Master Chief Torres saved 17 lives that day, including mine. 17 people who shouldn't exist walked out of Ramadi because of her." He paused. "They called her Reaper because death couldn't catch her." 10 seconds of absolute silence. The hospital held its breath. Dr. Caldwell's phone buzzed, he looked down at the screen and his face went gray, then white, then the color of someone who understood they'd just made a very expensive mistake. Investigator Robert Morrison pushed through the crowd holding a file folder thick enough to bury someone. "Dr. Caldwell," he said, professional and cold. "We need to talk. Now." She wasn't sure why she came back. Rachel Torres stood in the Cedar Creek Medical parking lot at 6:42 a.m., keys hanging from her right hand, staring at the building's glass entrance like it might hold answers. The suspension letter sat on her kitchen counter at home. The investigator's card sat next to it. Everything was over. Everything was supposed to be finished. But her feet had carried her here anyway, muscle memory insisting she return even when her discharge was written in clinical language that might as well have been a death certificate. The sunrise hit the concrete in shades of copper and ash. She turned toward her car, jaw tight, when the ICU entrance exploded open 17 meters to her left. A man emerged, 7 feet of pure adrenaline and rage, his eyes wild as a caged animal released, his voice cracking the morning air like a rifle shot. Where is she? Where's the nurse who killed my brother in Ramadi? Rachel's body went still. Not frozen. Still. There was a difference. Stillness was a choice. Stillness was the opposite of fear, it was recognition. She knew that face. Older now, weathered by 18 years, but she knew it the way a surgeon knows the anatomy of a heart. She'd seen him standing on a rooftop in the Jolin district, muzzle flash lighting his silhouette, AK-47 barking while she moved through the rubble below carrying an 8-year-old boy bleeding through her uniform. That face had haunted her through 2 decades of careful silence. That face was supposed to stay in the past, buried under the weight of classified files and redacted reports. The man spotted her. His body shifted, recognition hitting him a half-second before his legs moved. He raised a tire iron, the kind used to pry open car doors, to break windows, to crush bone, and charged toward her like a man possessed. You took him from me. You murdered my brother. No hesitation. No negotiation. Just raw velocity and intention to harm. Rachel sidestepped with the economy of motion that came from training that never wore away, her body reading his trajectory the way other people read text. As he rushed past, she pivoted, locked his right elbow between her forearm and her ribs, and used the whole momentum of his 7-foot frame against him. His own force became his weakness. Physics and leverage were neutral principles, they didn't care about rage or pain or 18 years of loss. She drove him forward and down, his body parallel to the asphalt, and his face hit the concrete with the sound of a watermelon dropped from a ladder. 3 seconds. Total. Rachel was on her knee against his spine before he could take a second breath, her hand pressing the base of his skull with the gentleness of someone who understood that too much pressure and she'd cause permanent damage. Her voice dropped, that voice she'd perfected across 2 decades of invisibility, to the cold, steady register of someone who had given orders under fire and meant every word. Don't move. Don't speak. Security is coming. She didn't hear the static of his rage anymore. She heard his breathing, ragged and desperate, heard the security chief's boots hitting the parking lot pavement in a run. James Reeves, retired Marine gunnery sergeant, who'd worked Cedar Creek's day shift for 11 years without ever asking why a temp nurse moved like she'd read the enemy's mind before they knew it themselves. Reeves stopped 3 meters away, and Rachel watched something shift behind his eyes. Not shock. Not exactly. Recognition. The kind of recognition that came from decades of military service, from reading body position and hand placement the way chess players read a board. His eyes moved across her stance, the knee placement, the angle of her arm, the distribution of her weight, and his voice came out in a whisper. Master Chief. The words hit the air and didn't bounce. They landed like truth. Like identity. Like 18 years of erasure collapsing in the time it took to speak 7 syllables. Rachel didn't acknowledge it. Didn't break her position. Just glanced at Reeves and tilted her chin toward the now bleeding man beneath her. Restraints. 2 point. He's disoriented, not cooperative, probably concussed. But the voice was different. The voice that gave that order wasn't the voice of the temp nurse who'd been escorted out of Cedar Creek Medical 18 hours earlier. This voice carried weight. Authority. The sound of someone who'd made decisions that cost lives when the decision was wrong, and saved lives when the decision was right. The ICU doors opened again and a patient emerged, still in his hospital gown, still trailing and fall-line, still holding his abdomen where a surgeon's knife had opened him up for an emergency gallbladder removal just 12 hours before. Lieutenant Marcus Webb, 2nd Battalion, looked at the man bleeding on the pavement, looked at Rachel Torres with her knee on his spine, looked at the gathered crowd of nurses and residents and security personnel, and his eyes filled with something that looked like vindication. That's her, he said. His voice cut through the morning like a bugle call. That's the woman who carried me 2 miles through enemy fire in Ramadi. When the building collapsed, I was trapped. I was 8 years old, bleeding out, and she came in alone under heavy fire, found me in the darkness, and carried me out while rounds were coming through the walls. I felt shrapnel hit her back. Actual shrapnel meant for me went into her instead. The gathered crowd had gone absolutely silent. The kind of silence where you could hear the hospital's vac system breathing through the rooftop vents. They gave her a Navy Cross for that, Marcus continued. Except the ceremony never happened. The entire operation was classified so deep that even my mother never knew the name of the woman who saved my life. I was 8. My parents told me my rescuer was someone brave. They didn't tell me she was Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres because the Pentagon said no one was there. No one carried me out. It never happened. Reeves had already called for restraints. 2 orderlies arrived with soft cuffs, and Rachel released the pressure on the man's spine with the same controlled precision she'd used to apply it. She stood, and the movement of her standing seemed to reorganize the entire parking lot. The nurses on break. The residents who'd come outside for air. The security team. Even the breathing of the man still bleeding on the pavement seemed to hold itself. A man in a dark suit emerged from the hospital, Robert Morrison, the external investigator who'd been tasked with building a termination case against her. But his face carried something different now. His briefcase hung loose in his right hand. His eyes were fixed on Rachel with the look of someone who'd just solved an equation that changed everything. "Dr. Caldwell," Morrison said quietly into his phone as he walked, "we need to talk. Now. And bring your attorney." The ICU doors opened one final time and Dr. Caldwell appeared, his face already betraying him. The fear was already there. The realization was already blooming. He saw Marcus Webb in his hospital gown telling the story. He saw Rachel Torres standing over the bleeding man. He saw the investigator holding his phone with the look of someone who'd finally found what he was searching for. By noon, the board had reviewed the supplementary files Morrison had compiled while Rachel's credentialing investigation was ostensibly going forward. By 1 p.m., Morrison was presenting findings to Patricia Chen, the hospital's chief of staff. The data showed everything. 6 years of surgical outcome reports that didn't match actual patient results. Selective reporting of complications. 3 cases reclassified from failures to successes. $47,000 in consulting payments from Cedar Medical, a device manufacturer whose spinal hardware Caldwell had ordered in 17 cases where alternatives were both cheaper and medically appropriate. The paper trail was immaculate because Caldwell had built it over 6 years with the precision of a man who understood that institutional protection required institutional sophistication. By 2 p.m., his surgical privileges were suspended pending investigation. By 4 p.m., a university administrator was reviewing his credentials at 3 other Portland hospitals where he held staff privileges. By 5 p.m., local news outlets had received anonymous tips about a major healthcare fraud investigation. By 6 p.m., Dr. Robert Caldwell sat in his office, his soon-to-be former office, and stared at the medical diplomas on his wall while HR personnel inventoried his desk for hospital property. 23 years of career. 12 years of board appointments. 5 years as chief of surgery. All of it collapsing like a building that only looked solid from the outside. He saw Rachel pass his office door, walking beside Reeves toward the security office to give her statement. She didn't look at him. Didn't acknowledge his existence with even the smallest flicker of her eyes. She walked past as if he were architectural detail, incidental, beneath her line of sight. The only thing worse than being seen was being invisible. Rachel sat in the hospital chapel alone for the first time since she'd arrived at Cedar Creek Medical. The suspension letter in her locker was gone. The investigator's business card in her pocket was no longer a threat. Marcus Webb had given her back her name. 18 years of careful invisibility had just been disintegrated in the parking lot, in the morning light, in front of 30 witnesses. She could feel her hand shaking now, not from fear, but from the release of it. The trembling wasn't weakness. The trembling was restraint finally giving way, 18 years of holding herself perfectly still suddenly allowed to move. 10 months later. Rachel Torres walked through Cedar Creek Medical's trauma department wearing navy blue scrubs with director embroidered on the chest pocket in silver thread. The limp from the shrapnel wound was barely noticeable now. 2 months of physical therapy and 30 years of forcing her body to function beyond pain had made it almost invisible. The white scar on her neck was visible and unremarked upon because everyone here knew the story. The hospital had made sure of it. The staff, permanent staff, not temporary, greeted her by name. They held doors. They asked for her opinion. They treated her with the respect that came from knowing exactly what you were standing beside. Her office overlooked the trauma bay. Inside, on a mahogany shelf beside her medical credentials, sat 2 photographs in identical frames. The first showed an 8-year-old boy covered in dust and blood, wrapped in someone's arms. The second showed Lieutenant Marcus Webb in dress uniform at his promotion ceremony, his fiancée's hand in his future visible in the set of his shoulders. Webb visited the hospital monthly now. Brought his fiancée. Brought photos of the house they were buying. Talked about the children they planned to have. Talked about the future that existed only because Rachel Torres had walked into a collapsed building under fire and chosen to carry a stranger's child out instead of walking past. At Lloyd Center Mall, in a food court between a pretzel stand and a cell phone kiosk, Dr. Marcus Caldwell sat at a folding table with a banner reading Lifeguard Supplemental Insurance in laminated letters. His medical license had been revoked 6 months into the investigation. The state medical board had found 23 case discrepancies, and the hospital's insurance had settled 3 separate malpractice suits from families who finally learned what had really happened to their loved ones. Caldwell handed out brochures to people who avoided eye contact. Sometimes he got a customer. Mostly he sat alone. Rachel didn't think about him. She'd learned long ago that carrying the weight of her enemies was just another way of letting them destroy her. At 3 p.m. she led trauma training for new residents, teaching direct cardiac massage on simulation dummies, her hands steady and sure as surgical lasers. A young nurse, someone fresh enough to still think of Cedar Creek as just a hospital, asked if the story was really true. Asked if Rachel had really saved a patient while she was suspended. Asked if Rachel had really been in the military. Rachel paused, her hand still resting on the dummy's sternum. "I saved him because he needed saving," she said. "That's the job. That's the only job that matters." At 6 p.m. she locked her office and walked to her car, past the window where she'd once caught her reflection at 3 a.m. and seen only a ghost, only erasure, only the careful absence of identity. Now she saw Master Chief Petty Officer Rachel Torres, nurse, director, the woman who'd carried 17 lives out of hell and kept carrying them even when the world tried to bury the entire operation under the weight of classified files and redacted reports. She drove home to an apartment that wasn't temporary anymore. A lease signed with her real name. Mail coming to an address that was hers. A life that wasn't borrowed from anyone else's mythology. She'd been called Reaper. She'd been called the temp nurse. She'd been called a ghost. She'd been called invisible. Now she was just called Rachel. And that was enough. That was everything. That was the prize that couldn't be taken away because it came from inside her, the knowledge of what she'd done, who she was, what she'd survived. No uniform could add it. No institution could erase it. No diagnosis of PTSD or survivor's guilt could diminish it. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated, overlooked, or forced to hide who you really are, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who needs to know that the quietest person in the room might just be the one holding everything together. And in the comments, tell me, have you ever judged someone only to find out you were dead wrong? Rachel's story isn't finished. Neither is yours.